Alien girl almost choked when her Soulmate indicator activated after touching the human. The galactic confluence station hummed with the steady drone of life support systems and the murmur of 1,000 different species going about their business. Commander Ethan Reeves strode confidently through the diplomatic wing, his bare torso covered only by a tactical vest that had seen better days. His blonde hair was neatly styled despite the chaos of the past few hours, and the hint of stubble on his jaw gave him a rugged edge that contrasted with his friendly smile. He wasn't supposed to be in this section of the station. The pristine corridors of the diplomatic quarter were typically off-limits to maintenance personnel. But the environmental control system had gone haywire, and as the station's chief engineer, he'd been called in personally. "Damn bureaucrats," he muttered, adjusting the tooled belt slung low on his tactical pants. A simple maintenance check would have prevented this mess. As he rounded the corner, his mind preoccupied with calculations and repair sequences, he collided with someone solid yet surprisingly soft. "Excuse me," a melodic voice said, the universal translator giving her words a slight echo. Ethan looked up and found himself staring into the most extraordinary pair of turquoise eyes he'd ever seen. They belonged to a humanoid alien woman with smooth green skin that seemed to shimmer under the station's lights. Her silvery white hair cascaded in waves over her shoulders, and her slender figure was accentuated by a form-fitting dark gray suit that hugged every curve. "The fault is entirely mine," Ethan said, extending his hand automatically. "Commander Ethan Reeves, Chief Engineer. I was called to fix the environmental controls." The alien woman hesitated before taking his hand. "Syria Nivarin, diplomatic envoy from Elysium Prime." The moment their hands touched, something extraordinary happened. A small device on Syria's wrist, something Ethan had initially mistaken for jewelry, began to pulse with a brilliant blue light. The alien's eyes widened in shock, and she made a strangled sound, pulling her hand away as if burned. "This is impossible," she gasped, staring at the pulsing light on her wrist. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a slight smirk. "Didn't think my handshake would be that impressive." Syria's composure, so carefully maintained through countless diplomatic negotiations, crumbled momentarily. She tapped frantically at the device, her fingers trembling. "Is everything all right?" Ethan asked, his smirk fading to concern. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "A minor malfunction." "I'm pretty good with malfunctions," he offered, gesturing to his tool belt. "It's kind of my job." "This isn't something you can fix with a wrench, Commander." Her voice had regained its diplomatic coolness, but her eyes betrayed her agitation. "This is a cultural artifact, very personal." Ethan nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Still, if it's causing you distress—" "It's not distress," she interrupted. "It's surprise. This device, it's called a Soulmate indicator. My people use them to identify physical and emotional compatibility. And let me guess, it's not supposed to light up when you shake hands with a human?" "It's not supposed to light up at all," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've had it since my coming-of-age ceremony. It's never activated before, for anyone." Ethan felt a strange flutter in his chest, something between pride and curiosity. "So what does that mean exactly?" Before Syria could answer, the corridor lights flickered when a deep rumble shook the station. Emergency klaxons began to wail. "That's not good," Ethan muttered, his professional instincts kicking in. He tapped his comm unit. "Reeves to control." "What's happening?" Static crackled through the comm. "Power, fluctuation, main grid, backup systems, failing." The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, bathing the corridor in an eerie red glow. "I need to get to engineering," Ethan said, already turning. "Wait," Syria called, her voice tight with what might have been fear. "The diplomatic quarter has separate systems. If those fail too—" Ethan understood immediately. The diplomatic quarter housed representatives from species with wildly different environmental needs. If those systems failed, people would die. "Come with me," he said, making a quick decision. "I need to check the auxiliary control panel in this section, and you can help me navigate." Syria hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Lead the way, Commander." As they moved through the dimly lit corridors, Ethan couldn't help but notice how the emergency lighting made Syria's green skin glow with an almost otherworldly luminescence. The device on her wrist continued to pulse softly, a gentle reminder of their unexpected connection. "So," Ethan said as they reached a junction, "these soulmate indicators of yours, are they always accurate?" Syria's steps faltered slightly. "They are considered infallible. They measure thousands of biological markers, pheromone responses, neural patterns. They've been the cornerstone of Elysian pair bonding for millennia. And yours just lit up for a human. That's got to be a first." "It is," she admitted. "Interspecies compatibility has been documented, but never with humans. Your species is relatively new to the galactic community." Ethan grinned. "We're full of surprises." "Indeed," Syria murmured, her eyes lingering on his face, tracing the faint scars that crossed his cheekbone and jaw. "Your kind has a reputation for being unpredictable." "Is that diplomatic speak for troublesome?" A small smile tugged at her lips. "Perhaps." They reached the auxiliary control panel, and Ethan immediately set to work, his fingers dancing across the interface with practiced ease. Syria watched, fascinated by the confidence in his movements. "You seem very skilled," she observed. "Been fixing things since I was a kid," he replied, not looking up from his work. "My dad was a mechanic on one of the first colony ships. He taught me that understanding how things break is the first step to making them unbreakable." "A wise philosophy." Ethan's hand stilled for a moment, and he glanced at her. "What about you? How does one become a diplomatic envoy from Elysium Prime?" "One is born into it," Syria said, a hint of something, resignation perhaps, in her voice. "My lineage has served in diplomatic roles for 12 generations." "No choice in the matter?" "There is always choice," she said carefully, "but duty and tradition are powerful motivators." The panel suddenly lit up, and Ethan let out a triumphant, "Ha!" as systems began to reboot. "Got it. This should stabilize the environmental controls in this section, at least temporarily." "That's impressive," Syria said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Just a temporary fix. We need to get to the main engineering bay to address the root cause." He straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Coming?" Syria looked uncertain. "I should report to my delegation." "Communications are down," Ethan pointed out, "and I could use someone who knows their way around diplomatic protocols if we run into any sensitive situations." She considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Commander. Lead on." As they made their way through the station, navigating darkened corridors and bypassing malfunctioning doors, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of Syria's presence beside him. There was something about her, a grace, an intelligence, a quiet strength that drew him in. "So," he said, breaking a comfortable silence, "that thing on your wrist, what happens now that it's activated?" Syria touched the device self-consciously. "Traditionally, when indicators activate, the individuals begin a courtship period. They spend time together, learning about each other, determining if the biological compatibility translates to emotional and intellectual harmony." "Sounds a lot like dating." "Dating?" The translator struggled with the term. "Human courtship," Ethan clarified, "getting to know someone to see if you're compatible." "Then yes, it is similar, though perhaps more formalized. And what if the individuals decide they're not compatible, despite what the indicator says?" Syria looked genuinely puzzled. "That rarely happens. The indicators are remarkably accurate in predicting successful pair bonds. But it does happen, occasionally," she admitted. "In such cases, the individuals part ways and the indicators are reset." They reached a sealed door and Ethan paused to override the lock. As the door slid open, revealing a maintenance shaft, he turned to Syria with a grin. "Well, Diplomat Nyvarin, looks like we're going on an impromptu first date. Hope you don't mind getting those fancy clothes a little dirty." To his surprise, Syria laughed, a sound like silver bells that made something warm unfurl in his chest. "I've navigated far more treacherous diplomatic waters than a maintenance shaft, Commander Reeves." "Call me Ethan," he said, offering his hand to help her into the shaft. She took it without hesitation this time, despite the renewed glow from her wrist device. "Ethan," she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. And you may call me Syria. As they crawled through the cramped space, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what twist of fate had brought them together and what it might mean for both of them. The maintenance shaft narrowed as they progressed, forcing Ethan and Syria to crawl in single file. The emergency lighting cast long shadows ahead of them, and the distant rumble of malfunctioning systems echoed through the metal walls. "How much farther?" Syria asked, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Just another 50 meters, Ethan replied, pausing to check a junction marker. "This shaft should connect directly to the secondary engineering bay." He glanced back at her, admiring how she maintained her dignity, even while crawling through a dusty maintenance tunnel. Her silvery hair was now tied back in a practical knot, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face. The blue glow from her wrist device cast an ethereal light on her green features. "You're staring, Commander," she noted, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Just making sure you're keeping up," he said with a grin. "And I thought we agreed on Ethan." "Ethan," she corrected, the name rolling off her tongue in a way that sent a pleasant shiver down his spine. "In my culture, using given names implies a level of intimacy that would normally take months to establish. And yet here we are, crawling through a maintenance shaft together after knowing each other for less than an hour. I'd say we're skipping a few steps in the traditional getting-to-know-you process." Syria's lips curved into a small smile. "Indeed, though I must admit, this is not how I envisioned my day proceeding when I woke this morning. No diplomatic crises on your agenda. Nothing quite this hands-on," she replied, her eyes twinkling with unexpected humor. They reached a junction, and Ethan paused to override another security panel. As the small hatch slid open, he gestured for Syria to go first. "Ladies first, that's a human custom." "We have a similar concept," she said as she gracefully maneuvered through the opening, "though it's less about gender and more about rank." "And what rank would you assign me?" Ethan asked, following her through the hatch. Syria turned to help him up, their hands connecting once more. The device on her wrist pulsed brighter. "Higher than you might expect," she said softly. They found themselves in a small auxiliary control room. Ethan immediately moved to the main console, his fingers flying over the controls as he assessed the situation. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered, scanning the readouts. "Primary and secondary power grids are completely offline. Life support is running on emergency power, but that won't last more than 6 hours." "Could this be an accident?" Siri asked, moving to stand beside him, close enough that he could detect a faint, exotic scent. "Something like cinnamon and ozone." Ethan shook his head. "Too many systems failed simultaneously. This was deliberate." "Sabotage," Syria breathed, her turquoise eyes widening. "But who would—" "That's the million-credit question," Ethan said grimly. He tapped a few more commands into the console. "I need to get to the main engineering bay. From there, I might be able to reroute enough power to get critical systems back online." "I'll come with you," Syria said without hesitation. Ethan looked at her, taking in her determined expression. "It could be dangerous. Whoever did this might still be out there. All the more reason you shouldn't go alone," she countered. "Besides, my diplomatic credentials will grant us access to restricted areas if needed." He couldn't argue with her logic, but there was something more in her insistence, a reluctance to part ways that echoed his own feelings. The connection between them, whatever it was, had grown stronger in the short time they'd spent together. "It's all right," he conceded, "but stay close." They exited the auxiliary control room through a different hatch, emerging into a corridor that was eerily silent. The normal bustle of the station, the constant hum of machinery, the chatter of diverse species, was absent, replaced by an oppressive quiet broken only by the occasional distant alarm. "It's too quiet," Syria whispered, unconsciously moving closer to Ethan. "Most of the station's personnel have probably evacuated to the emergency shelters," he explained, his hand instinctively moving to the small of her back as they navigated the darkened hallway. "Standard protocol during a major systems failure." The simple touch sent a jolt of awareness through both of them. Syria's breath caught audibly, and Ethan felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the failing environmental controls. He didn't remove his hand, and she didn't pull away. They reached a sealed door marked, "Engineering Authorized Personnel Only." Ethan swiped his access card, but the panel remained dark. "Power's completely out here," he muttered, kneeling to examine the manual override. "I'll need to force it open." "Allow me," Syria said, stepping forward. She removed a small device from a hidden pocket in her suit and attached it to the door's control panel. The device hummed softly, and seconds later the door slid open a few inches. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Standard diplomatic equipment. A mischievous smile played across Syria's lips. Let's just say that diplomacy sometimes requires creative solutions. Remind me never to play poker with you, Ethan said with a laugh as he wedged his fingers into the gap and pushed the door open wider. They squeezed through the opening and found themselves in the dimly lit engineering bay. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across the massive room, filled with towering equipment and complex machinery. The usual team of engineers was nowhere to be seen. They must have evacuated, Ethan said, moving quickly to the main control station. Good. That means they followed protocol. He began working at the console, his expression growing increasingly grim as he assessed the damage. This is definitely sabotage. Someone manually overrode the safety protocols and induced a cascade failure in the power grid. Can you fix it? Syria asked, watching his hands move with practiced efficiency over the controls. I can bypass some of the damaged systems and reroute power from the auxiliary generators, he said, not looking up from his work. It won't be enough to get everything back online, but it should buy us more time for life support. As Ethan worked, Syria moved around the engineering bay, examining the equipment with curious eyes. She paused at a workstation where a half-eaten meal sat abandoned, evidence of the hasty evacuation. Your people are remarkably adaptable, she observed. Most species would panic in a situation like this. We've had plenty of practice with disasters, Ethan replied, his focus still on the console. Humanity's history is basically one crisis after another. We either adapt or die. That explains much about your reputation in the galactic community, Syria said thoughtfully. Many species find humans unsettling. You accomplish in decades what takes others centuries, and you thrive in conditions that would break most races. Ethan glanced up, a hint of pride in his expression. We're stubborn that way. It's more than stubbornness, Syria said, moving closer to him. There's a fire in your species, a drive that both fascinates and frightens the older races. Including yours? Ethan asked, his hands stilling on the controls. Syria's gaze met his, unflinching. Especially mine. Elysians value control, stability, predictability. Humans represent the opposite: chaos, innovation, passion. You say that like they're bad things. They're challenging things, she corrected, particularly for a culture that has spent millennia perfecting the art of emotional regulation. Ethan's brow furrowed. Is that what the Soulmate indicators are about? Regulating emotions? Syria looked down at the pulsing device on her wrist. In a way, they remove uncertainty from pair bonding, ensuring optimal genetic and temperamental compatibility. Sounds clinical, Ethan observed. It is efficient, she countered, but there was a note of something like doubt in her voice. And yet yours lit up for me, a chaotic, passionate human, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a lower register as he stepped closer to her. What does that say about your optimal compatibility, diplomat Niverin? The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the station's power systems. Syria's turquoise eyes darkened, and the glow from her wrist device intensified. It says, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, that perhaps there are aspects of compatibility that even our advanced technology cannot fully predict. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and tucked a stray strand of silvery hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her green skin, which was surprisingly warm to the touch. Where I come from, he said softly, we call that chemistry. Syria's eyes fluttered closed for a moment at his touch. When she opened them again, there was a new intensity in her gaze. An apt term. There does seem to be a reaction between us. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then an alarm blared from the console, shattering the tension. Ethan reluctantly turned back to the controls. I've managed to reroute some power, but there's a problem in Section 17. The environmental seals are failing. That's the Xenobotanical Research Lab, Syria said, instantly alert. There are specimens there from dozens of worlds, including several that could become toxic if exposed to station atmosphere. We need to get there now, Ethan said, already moving toward the exit. If those specimens get loose in the ventilation system, It would be catastrophic, Syria finished, following close behind him. They raced through the corridors, guided by Ethan's knowledge of the station's layout. As they ran, the lights flickered ominously, and the temperature began to drop noticeably. Environmental controls are starting to fail, Ethan explained between breaths. We're running out of time. They reached Section 17 to find the door sealed and a warning light flashing above them. Ethan quickly accessed the control panel. The automatic quarantine protocols kicked in, he said. That's good. It means the specimens are still contained, but we need to get in there to stabilize the environmental systems. Can you override it? Syria asked, rubbing her arms as the temperature continued to drop. Yes, but there's a problem, Ethan said grimly. Once we're inside, the quarantine will reestablish. We'll be locked in until either we fix the problem or someone from outside overrides the lockdown. Given the current state of the station, I think we can assume the latter is unlikely, Syria observed. Exactly. We'll be on our own. Syria straightened her shoulders, her diplomatic poise returning. Then we should proceed. The safety of the station takes precedence. Ethan nodded, admiring her courage. Stay close to me once we're inside. Some of those plants can be nasty. He overrode the quarantine protocols and the doors slid open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. They stepped inside and, as predicted, the doors immediately sealed behind them. The Xenobotanical Lab was a vast greenhouse filled with plants from across the galaxy. Under normal circumstances, different sections maintained distinct environments to suit the needs of various species. Now, with the environmental controls failing, fog rolled across the floor as cold air met warm, humid pockets. The control station should be at the center, Ethan said, peering through the mist. We need to... A loud crash interrupted him as something large toppled in the distance. They froze, listening intently. That didn't sound like equipment failing, Syria whispered. No, Ethan agreed, his hand moving instinctively to his side, where a weapon would normally be. Finding nothing, he grabbed a heavy tool from his belt instead. It didn't. They moved cautiously through the fog-shrouded laboratory, navigating between rows of exotic plants. Some seemed to react to their presence, turning to follow their movement or retreating into protective postures. Someone's here, Ethan whispered, pointing to fresh footprints in the condensation on the floor. They followed the tracks to the central control station, where they found clear evidence of sabotage. The main console had been physically damaged, wires pulled out and components smashed. This was deliberate, Syria said, examining the destruction. But why target the Xenobotanical Lab specifically? Maybe they weren't targeting the lab, Ethan suggested, kneeling to examine the damage more closely. Maybe they were after something inside it. A soft rustling sound came from behind them. They turned to see a tall, shadowy figure moving through the mist. Before either could react, the figure raised what looked like a weapon. Ethan reacted instinctively, tackling Syria to the ground as energy crackled through the air where they had been standing. They rolled behind a large planter as another blast hit the control console, sending sparks flying. Are you okay? Ethan asked, his body protectively covering Syria's. Yes, she breathed, her eyes wide but focused. The position brought them face to face, their bodies pressed together in a way that would have been intimate under different circumstances, and somehow still was, despite the danger. The attacker fired again, the energy blast singeing the plants above their heads. Ethan could feel Syria's heart racing against his chest, matching his own accelerated pulse. We need to move, he whispered. On my count. 1, 2, 3. They scrambled to their feet and dashed deeper into the laboratory, ducking behind the dense foliage of an enormous fern-like plant. The attacker's footsteps followed, slow and deliberate. Who would do this? Syria whispered, her breath warm against Ethan's ear. I don't know, he replied, but they came prepared. That's a military-grade energy weapon. They crouched in silence, listening as the footsteps drew closer. The temperature in the lab continued to drop, and Syria shivered involuntarily. Without thinking, Ethan pulled her closer, sharing his body heat. Sorry, she whispered, embarrassed. Elysians are sensitive to cold. Don't apologize, he murmured, his arms tightening around her. Despite the danger, he couldn't ignore how perfectly she fit against him, or the way her scent clouded his thoughts. The footsteps paused, then began moving away. Ethan risked a peek around the massive fern and saw the shadowy figure heading toward the far end of the laboratory. "They're moving away," he whispered. "This might be our chance to get to the auxiliary controls and lock down this section properly." "Where are the auxiliary control?" Syria asked. Ethan pointed to a small panel on the wall about 20 meters away. "There. It won't fix the damage, but it might contain whatever they're after and trap them in here with us." "That sounds like a risky plan," Syria observed, but there was no fear in her voice, only a cool assessment of their options. "Welcome to Human Crisis Management," Ethan replied with a grim smile. "We specialize in risky plans." They waited until the attacker disappeared behind a row of tall, spiny plants, then moved quickly but quietly toward the auxiliary control panel. They had almost reached it when the environmental systems gave another ominous shudder. The lights flickered and a blast of frigid air swept through the laboratory. Syria stumbled, her limbs suddenly stiff with cold. Ethan caught her before she could fall, pulling her against his chest. "Elysians really don't do well in the cold, do they?" he asked, concerned by how quickly she had been affected. "Our homeworld has a stable tropical climate," she explained through chattering teeth. "We never developed resistance to extreme temperatures." Ethan made a quick decision. He guided her to a small alcove formed by the roots of a massive tree-like plant and sat down, pulling her into his lap. "What are you doing, Yaitinen?" she asked, though she didn't resist. "Sharing body heat," he explained, wrapping his arms around her. "Humans are pretty good at temperature regulation. It's one of our evolutionary advantages." Syria hesitated only briefly before relaxing against him, her back to his chest. "This is most irregular diplomatic protocol," she murmured, but there was a hint of humor in her voice. "I won't tell if you won't," Ethan replied, his breath warming the back of her neck. They sat in silence for a moment, listening for any sign of the attacker. The Soulmate indicator on Syria's wrist pulsed steadily, casting a blue glow over them both. "It's getting stronger," Ethan observed, nodding toward the device. Syria looked down at it, a complex expression crossing her features. "Yes, it responds to proximity and emotional resonance." "Emotional resonance?" Ethan repeated, his voice low near her ear. "I thought your people were all about emotional regulation." "Regulation, not elimination," she clarified. "We feel deeply, perhaps more deeply than most species. That's why we develop systems to manage those feelings." "And right now, what is your system telling you to feel?" Ethan asked, unable to stop himself. Syria turned slightly in his arms, her face now inches from his. "It's telling me that there is a 98.7% compatibility between us," she whispered. "It's telling me that despite all logical, cultural, and biological improbabilities, you and I are matched." The air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility. Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips, which were a darker shade of green than her skin, almost teal. He wondered if they would taste as exotic as they looked. "And what do you think about that?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. "I think," Syria said slowly, her turquoise eyes holding his, "that for the first time in my life, I understand why some of my people choose to ignore the indicators and follow their instincts instead." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. "And what are your instincts telling you right now?" Instead of answering with words, Syria closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentative, but quickly blazed into something more urgent. Her lips were soft and warm, with a slight sweetness that reminded Ethan of honey. He responded immediately, one hand moving to cradle the back of her head, fingers tangling in her silky hair. The Soulmate indicator pulsed brighter, its light seeming to synchronize with the racing of their hearts. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Syria's eyes were wide with wonder and a hint of shock at her own boldness. "That was she began. "Yeah," Ethan agreed, equally stunned by the intensity of their connection. A crash from nearby shattered the moment. They sprang apart, instantly alert again. The shadowy figure was moving back toward the center of the lab, methodically searching each section. "We need to move," Ethan whispered. "The auxiliary controls are just over there." Syria nodded, her diplomatic composure returning despite the flush still evident on her cheeks. "Lead the way." They crept from their hiding place, staying low and using the plants as cover. The cold was becoming more intense, and Ethan could see his breath misting in the air. Syria moved more slowly now, fighting against her body's natural response to the dropping temperature. They reached the auxiliary control panel, and Ethan immediately set to work, his fingers flying over the interface despite the cold. Syria stood guard, watching for any sign of the attacker. "Almost got it," Ethan muttered. "Just need to—" A beam of energy sliced through the air, missing Ethan's head by inches and hitting the wall behind him. He ducked instinctively, pulling Syria down with him. "Found us," he said grimly. The attacker emerged from the mist, weapon raised. Now that they could see him clearly, Ethan recognized the species. A draconian reptilian humanoids known for their mercenary work. The cold that was debilitating Syria seemed to be affecting him as well. His movements were sluggish, and his scaled skin had taken on a dull gray hue. "Stay where you are," the draconian hissed, his forked tongue flicking out between sharp teeth. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded, positioning himself slightly in front of Syria. "The Terran specimen," the mercenary replied. "Where is it?" Ethan and Syria exchanged confused glances. "What Terran specimen?" Syria asked. "Don't play stupid," the draconian snarled. "The hybrid plant. My employer wants it, and I'm not leaving without it." Ethan's mind raced. He knew the Xenobotanical lab contained specimens from Earth, but he couldn't think of any that would be valuable enough to warrant this level of sabotage. "Look around you," he said, gesturing to the vast laboratory. "There are thousands of plants here. We don't know which one you're talking about." The draconian's eyes narrowed. "The one that shouldn't exist? The one your scientists created by accident?" Understanding dawned on Syria's face. "The adaptive orchid," she whispered to Ethan. "It was a diplomatic incident 6 months ago. A Terran orchid cross-pollinated with an Elysian firebloom. The resulting hybrid showed remarkable adaptive properties. It can survive in almost any environment and has potential medical applications." "Bingo," the draconian said, having overheard. "Now, where is it?" Ethan's mind worked quickly. If this hybrid plant was as valuable as it seemed, letting it fall into the wrong hands could be disastrous. But they were at a disadvantage, unarmed and trapped. "It's in Section C," he lied smoothly. "Environmental Containment Unit 12. But the units are locked down during emergencies. You'll need a command-level override." The draconian hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust them. "Show me," he finally demanded. "Put down the weapon first," Ethan countered. "The cold is affecting all of us. We don't need to make this situation worse." For a tense moment, it seemed like the mercenary might refuse. Then, perhaps realizing that the rapidly dropping temperature was as much a threat to him as Ethan's potential resistance, he lowered the weapon slightly. "Fine, but any tricks, and I shoot the female first." Ethan felt Syria stiffen beside him, but kept his expression neutral. "This way," he said, moving slowly toward a different section of the lab, his mind racing to formulate a plan. As they walked, Ethan noticed that the draconian was becoming increasingly affected by the cold. Draconians, being reptilian, were even more susceptible to low temperatures than Elysians. It was only a matter of time before the mercenary would be too sluggish to pose a threat. But the same was true for Syria, who was already shivering violently despite her efforts to hide it. They needed to end this quickly. Ethan led them on a winding path through the laboratory, deliberately taking a route that exposed them to colder areas. The draconian fell further behind, his movements becoming visibly slower. "What's your plan?" Syria whispered, her teeth chattering. "Using our evolutionary advantages," Ethan murmured back. "Humans can handle cold better than either of your species. He'll slow down faster than I will." "Clever," she acknowledged, "but I'm not sure how much longer I can stay functional either." Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just a little longer. Trust me." They reached a section filled with tall, spiny plants that created a natural maze. Ethan deliberately slowed his pace, allowing the draconian to draw closer. "It's just through here," he called back to the mercenary, who was now several meters behind them, his weapon drooping in his sluggish grip. As soon as they rounded a corner, hidden from the draconian's view, Ethan pulled Syria close and whispered urgently, "When I give the signal, run to the left and hide. I'm going to take him down. Syria's eyes widened. He's armed and nearly immobile from the cold, Ethan pointed out. This is our best chance. Before she could protest further, the Draconian rounded the corner, his movements now visibly labored. His scaled skin had taken on a bluish tinge and his breath came in visible puffs. Where is it? He demanded, his speech slurring slightly. Just ahead, Ethan said, then suddenly shouted, Now! Syria darted to the left as instructed, while Ethan charged directly at the surprised mercenary. The Draconian tried to raise his weapon, but his reflexes were too slow. Ethan tackled him to the ground, the weapon skittering across the floor. Despite his weakened state, the Draconian was still strong. He hissed in rage, sharp teeth snapping at Ethan's face as they grappled on the cold floor. Ethan managed to pin one of the mercenary's arms, but the other caught him across the jaw, claws raking in his skin. Ethan grunted in pain but didn't relent, using his superior cold tolerance to maintain the upper hand. He landed a solid punch to the Draconian's throat, causing the reptilian to gag and loosen his grip. Taking advantage of the moment, Ethan flipped the mercenary onto his stomach and wrenched his arms behind his back. Syria! Find something to tie him up with! Syria emerged from her hiding place, quickly scanning their surroundings. She spotted a coil of flexible tubing used for the irrigation system and grabbed it, bringing it to Ethan. Together, they bound the Draconian's hands and feet. By now, the mercenary was barely conscious, his cold-blooded physiology shutting down in the frigid temperature. We need to get back to the auxiliary controls, Ethan said, retrieving the mercenary's weapon and helping Syria to her feet. Can you make it? Syria nodded determinedly, though her movements were becoming as sluggish as the Draconians. Yes, let's finish this. They made their way back to the control panel, Ethan supporting Syria as her steps faltered. When they reached it, he immediately resumed his work, fingers flying over the interface despite the numbness creeping into them. Got it, he exclaimed as the panel lit up. I'm sealing off this section and rerouting emergency power to the environmental controls. Temperature should start rising soon. As if on cue, the vents hummed to life, and warm air began to circulate through the laboratory. Syria sagged against Ethan in relief, her body trembling from the cold in the aftermath of adrenaline. You did it, she murmured, looking up at him with admiration. We did it, he corrected, wrapping an arm around her waist to steady her. You were amazing. Their eyes met, and the tension from earlier returned, amplified by their shared victory. The Soulmate indicator on Syria's wrist pulsed brightly between them, a tangible reminder of their unexpected connection. So, Ethan said softly, his free hand coming up to gently trace the curve of her cheek. About that kiss. A small smile played across Syria's lips. A most illuminating experience. I was thinking we might need to investigate it further, Ethan suggested, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. For diplomatic purposes, of course. Of course, Syria agreed, her turquoise eyes darkening as she leaned closer. Thorough research is essential for proper interspecies relations. Their lips met again, more confidently this time, the warmth of their bodies mingling as the laboratory slowly heated around them. The Soulmate indicator pulsed in time with their racing hearts, its light a beacon in the misty greenhouse. In that moment, trapped in a sabotaged space station with a bound mercenary and countless dangers still ahead, Ethan and Syria found something neither had expected, a connection that defied logic, biology, and the vast differences between their worlds. And as the warmth returned to their bodies, a different kind of heat built between them, one that promised to challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. As warmth gradually returned to the xenobotanical lab, Ethan and Syria reluctantly separated, though their eyes remained locked in silent communication. The Soulmate indicator on Syria's wrist continued its steady, pulsing glow, casting blue reflections across their faces. We should secure our prisoner and report to station security, Syria said, her diplomatic training reasserting itself despite the flush still evident on her green cheeks. Right, Ethan agreed, though he made no immediate move to step away. His fingers lingered at her waist, reluctant to break contact. Security, prisoner, responsible adults and all that. As they secured the Draconian mercenary and made their way through the station's corridors, Ethan couldn't help but notice how the emergency lighting made Syria's green skin glow with an almost otherworldly luminescence. The device on her wrist continued to pulse softly, a gentle reminder of their unexpected connection. "So," Ethan said as they reached a junction, "these soulmate indicators of yours, are they always accurate?" Syria's steps faltered slightly. "They are considered infallible. They measure thousands of biological markers, pheromone responses, neural patterns. They've been the cornerstone of Elysian pair bonding for millennia. And yours just lit up for a human. That's got to be a first." "It is," she admitted. "Interspecies compatibility has been documented, but never with humans. Your species is relatively new to the galactic community." Ethan grinned. "We're full of surprises." They reached the security office to find it deserted, most personnel having evacuated to emergency shelters. Ethan secured the Draconian in a holding cell, then moved to the main console to assess the station's status. "The sabotage is more extensive than I thought," he muttered, scanning the readouts. "Someone really wanted to cause chaos." A sudden, searing pain lanced through his head, dropping him to his knees with a strangled cry. Images flashed behind his eyes. Fire, twisted metal, screaming, accompanied by a high-pitched whine that seemed to drill into his skull. "Ethan!" Syria's voice sounded distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. He felt her hands on his shoulders, steadying him, but couldn't focus on her face through the barrage of memories. "It's happening again," he gasped, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. "Just like on the Hyperion. What's happening? Ethan, talk to me!" The concern in Syria's voice penetrated the fog of pain. With a supreme effort, Ethan forced the memories back, focusing on Syria's face, on the genuine worry in her turquoise eyes. Gradually, the pain receded, leaving him shaking and covered in cold sweat. "Sorry," he managed, his voice hoarse. It happens sometimes. Flashbacks." Understanding dawned on Syria's face. "The scars," she said softly, her fingers gently tracing the faint marks on his cheek and jaw. "They're not just physical, are they?" Ethan closed his eyes, leaning slightly into her touch. "No," he admitted. "There was an incident 3 years ago. I was chief engineer on the Hyperion, a research vessel. We were testing a new propulsion system when sabotage caused a catastrophic failure. 37 people died. I couldn't save them." "The sabotage pattern," Syria said, making the connection. "It's similar to what happened here." Ethan nodded, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. Too similar to be coincidence. The cascading systems failure, the targeted destruction of specific components, it's the same methodology. "No one believed you," Syria guessed, her hand still steadying him. "They said I was traumatized, seeing patterns that weren't there. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince them." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I requested a transfer to Galactic Confluence Station, thinking I could put it behind me. But now it's followed you here," Syria finished. Her understanding, her immediate acceptance of his truth without question, created a connection between them that transcended the physical attraction or even the soulmate indicator's pronouncement. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a wall beginning to crumble, a wound finally exposed to healing air. The security console beeped, drawing their attention. Surveillance footage showed a figure in maintenance coveralls accessing a restricted area near the docking bays. "I know him," Ethan said, his voice tight with sudden recognition. "That's Davis, Assistant Director of Station Operations. He was on the Hyperion too, one of the few survivors besides me." "Your saboteur," Syria concluded, her expression hardening with determination. "We need to stop him, not just for the station, but for those who died on the Hyperion." They moved quickly through the station, following Davis's trail to Docking Bay 7. The doors were sealed, but Syria's diplomatic override granted them access. Inside, they found Davis preparing a shuttle for departure, a container of what appeared to be biological specimens secured in the cargo hold. "It's over, Davis," Ethan called, the energy weapon they'd taken from the Draconian steady in his hands. "Step away from the shuttle." Davis looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to cold calculation. "Reeves, should have known you'd be a problem again." "Why?" Ethan demanded, the question that had haunted him for 3 years, finally directed at its target. Why sabotage the Hyperion? Why kill all those people? Collateral damage, Davis said with chilling indifference. The research was the target. Adaptive biotech is the future of warfare, of human evolution itself. My employers recognized that long before the galactic confluence was willing to admit it. As Davis reached for a weapon, Syria moved with unexpected speed, knocking it from his hand. The sudden movement caused Davis to stumble backward, his head striking a cargo container with a sickening crack. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. "Nice move," Ethan said, impressed by her quick reflexes. "Diplomatic training includes self-defense," Syria replied with a small smile. "Not all negotiations are conducted verbally." They secured Davis and alerted station security, which was gradually returning to operational status as systems came back online. With the immediate threat contained, they retreated to Ethan's quarters to tend to minor injuries and await debriefing. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving them both drained but acutely aware of each other in the intimate space of Ethan's living area. The Soulmate indicator continued its steady pulse, a visual representation of the connection they both felt growing stronger by the hour. "Your shoulder," Ethan said, noticing how Syria winced when she moved. "You were injured in the fight." "It's minor," she assured him, though she didn't resist when he gently examined the bruise forming on her green skin. His touch lingered, no longer clinical but exploratory, tracing the subtle differences between her physiology and his own. Syria's breath caught, her turquoise eyes darkening as she watched his face. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice taking on a husky quality that sent heat coursing through him. "There's something you should know about Elysian physiology." "What's that?" he asked, his voice equally low. "When the Soulmate indicator activates, it triggers certain responses in our bodies. Heightened sensitivity, increased pheromone production, accelerated bonding instincts." Ethan's hand stilled on her shoulder. "Are you saying your device is drugging you into wanting me?" Syria laughed, the sound like silver bells. "No, nothing so crude. It's simply amplifying what's already there. The potential, the compatibility, the desire." The last word hung between them, charged with possibility. Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips, which were a darker shade of green than her skin, almost teal. "And is there?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. "Desire?" In answer, Syria closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentative but quickly blazed into something more urgent. Her lips were soft and warm, with a slight sweetness that reminded Ethan of honey. He responded immediately, one hand moving to cradle the back of her head, fingers tangling in her silky hair. The Soulmate indicator pulsed brighter, its light seeming to synchronize with the racing of their hearts. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Syria's eyes were wide with wonder and a hint of shock at her own boldness. "That was..." she began. "Yeah," Ethan agreed, equally stunned by the intensity of their connection. "I've never..." Syria hesitated, searching for words. Elysians are taught to value emotional control, to approach relationships with logical consideration rather than instinctive reaction. "But with you..." "With me?" Ethan prompted when she trailed off. "With you, I feel untethered," she said, searching for the right words. "As if all my careful training and cultural conditioning mean nothing in the face of this pull between us." The vulnerability in her admission touched Ethan deeply. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "I don't know," she confessed. "It's terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I've never experienced emotions this raw before." Ethan's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "Maybe that's what the indicator is really telling us, that we each have something the other needs. You bring order to my chaos and you bring fire to my discipline," Syria finished, her eyes darkening further as she leaned into his touch. "You make me feel alive in ways I never knew were possible." Their lips met again, more urgently this time, hands exploring with growing boldness. The Soulmate indicator's pulse accelerated, matching the rhythm of their racing hearts as they discovered each other's bodies. similar in form but delightfully different in detail. What followed was a dance of discovery, of learning and teaching, of boundaries crossed and new territories claimed. Elysian and human physiologies proved remarkably compatible, guided by instinct and the indicator's silent affirmation. Their union was both tender and fierce, controlled and abandoned, a perfect balance of their contrasting natures. Afterward, they lay entwined, the blue glow of the soulmate indicator casting gentle shadows across their intermingled forms. Ethan traced lazy patterns on Syria's green skin, marveling at its silken texture and the way it seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light. "So," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "on a scale of 1 to diplomatic incident, how much trouble are we in?" Syria laughed, the sound vibrating against his chest where her head rested. "Technically, interspecies relations fall under my diplomatic purview, so I could argue we're simply strengthening ties between our peoples." "Is that what we're calling it?" Ethan teased, echoing her earlier question. "What would you call it?" she asked, suddenly serious as she propped herself up to look into his eyes. Ethan considered the question, aware of its weight. "I'd call it the beginning of something I never expected, but now can't imagine being without." The soulmate indicator pulsed in agreement, its light steady and true between them. "My people will be shocked," Sirius said, her fingers tracing the scars on his face with gentle reverence. "A human-Elysian pair bond is unprecedented." "Humans have a saying," Ethan replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "The best traditions were once innovations." "Wise words for a species so young," Siri observed with a smile. "We have our moments," Ethan said, pulling her close again. "And I'm looking forward to many more moments with you, Diplomat Nyvarin, diplomatic incidents and all." As they drifted towards sleep, still entwined, the soulmate indicator's pulse slowed to a steady, contented rhythm. A beacon in the darkness, guiding them through uncharted territory toward a future neither could have imagined, but both now embraced with open hearts.